Hi, this is the voice, Michael Chavello. You're listening to the Premium Oddscast, hosted by leading MMA odds maker Nick Kalikas, fight scientist and author of Fightnomics Reed Kuhn, and MMA journalist Brian Heminger. The absolute best UFC betting info, picks, statistics, and analysis from the most respected authority in mixed martial arts betting, MMAoddsbreaker.com.
Welcome to the Premium Oddscast, presented by Five Dime Sportsbook and Countermove, your home for fantasy MMA. I'm Brian Heminger, joined today by leading mixed martial arts oddsmaker Nick Kalikas to break down this Saturday's UFC on Fox 16 event, which takes place in Chicago, Illinois. If you're unfamiliar with our format, myself and Nick will be breaking down the fight card from top to bottom, providing extensive analysis and a pick for each fight after doing our film study for the event. Then, fight scientist Reed Kuhn will step in and offer his expansive numerical insight on all bouts with sufficient data. Today, Reed will be able to contribute on 9 total bouts. Briefly looking back at our last events, our premium package bets for UFC Fight Night 72 and Bellator 140 went 2-0 to win 5.72 units overall. We won our underdog bet on Andrei Koreshkov, as well as our parlay on Stevie Ray with the Pakel and LeBeau over 1.5 rounds total. We also did lose our 1-unit free bet on Vaughn Lee at plus 145. Back to the present, UFC on Fox 16 features a 12-fight card in total and will be aired on UFC Fight Pass and Big Network Fox this Saturday night. Let's dive right in. Now, kicking off the preliminary card on UFC Fight Pass is a welterweight contest between Zach Cummings, who is 17-4, and Dominique Steele, who is 13-5. Now, Nick, where did you open this fight, and how has the public shifted things so far?
I up at Cummings minus 350, the comeback on Steele plus 250, and right now looking over 5 dimes, it is 100 cents lower. It's now Cummings minus 250, the comeback on Steele is plus 210. So more support coming in on Dom Steele. Tough spot here because honestly, I mean, Dominic Steele, if you look at what he's done recently, I know he's a Bellator vet. Most of you guys know him from watching him fight against Brian Rogers and losing by decision. And I don't want to say one-sided fight, but Rogers definitely had his way with Dom Steele in that fight and deserved to get the win at least. But again, Dom Steele being outsized, you got to give him credit for his heart and his toughness in a fight like that as well. So that's the background with him as far as I think the mainstream MMA fans. That's where you're going to probably relate or see him. He's all on Access TV shows as far as like CES MMA 29 recently. He has a win over Chuck O'Neal, so maybe some of you guys are checking out Access cards. You got to see him fight there as well. But what you get with Dom Steele is pretty much a well-rounded fighter, but not great at certain areas. Like I think his stand-up game's okay, but he's going to get outstruck by most, I think, in the welterweight division. No doubt about that. He's more of your grinder, more of a wrestler type of fighter that looks to take the fight to the floor. His submission game is okay, but again, it's not great. So he's not really going to knock you out on the feet. He's really not going to submit you on the ground. I mean, it's possible for both, but at the same time, he's more of your grinder. Get the fight to the floor, outpoint you, lay on you a little bit, just control the tempo of the fight and get your decision win. And that's exactly what he did against Chuck O'Neal in that championship fight at CES. So that's what you get out of Dom Steele. Now, you got to give him credit. It was good. He's been putting in a lot of work. He actually dropped to 170, which is a division where he really does belong. And I think he could definitely win some fights along the way, but his matchup with Zach Cummings is very tough, because Zach Cummings, he's one guy that's really been flying under the radar. I mean, there's not a lot of buzz or popularity surrounding Zach Cummings, but the truth is he's a very talented fighter. I mean, the guy is not bad on the feet. He continues to improve that. He's more known again for his ground game. He's got good submissions. He's got decent wrestling. And he's more than capable of beating people on the ground and beating people on the mat. I mean, if you look at his fight against Jan Cabral, that's a big indicator right there. Cabral is a very talented jiu-jitsu practitioner, and Cummings was able to stifle any of Cabral's offense and basically out-cardio him a little bit and win an impressive decision over a guy like that. He was a big underdog in that fight. Even against Gunnar Nelson, his last fight, ended up finally getting caught and choked, but he was game in that fight as well. So Cummings has fought decent competition throughout his career, even at heavier weights at times. He's a savvy MMA veteran, and he's actually underrated as far as skill set goes. So here's the thing with Dominic Steele. I just really don't see any area that he's going to be better than Cummings. I think his best path to victory, Steele's, would be to actually try to get Cummings on his back, and again, just kind of smother him and lay on him a little bit and control him. I think it's going to be tough because Cummings' takedown defense overall is pretty solid. And again, I think he's savvy enough that if he does get put on his back. With his submission game, with his scrambling ability, I don't know if Steele's going to be able to keep him there and control it. And then on the feet, I do give the edge to Cummings. I think in submissions overall, you got to give him the edge as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if he actually is the first to submit Dom Steele in his career either, because Cummings has that kind of capabilities with finishing fights. So it's really Cummings' fight to win or lose, I think, across the board here. I think Steele's just a little bit outclassed, and I do see why people are coming in on the dog, because it seemed like a very high line overall. But I said it that way because there's a reason. I really think that Cummings is the more talented fighter, and again, looking at it pretty much across the board. So Steele, decent fighter. I'm glad he's getting his shot finally in the UFC. I mean, he's been working at it for a long time, but unfortunately for him, stylistically, Cummings is a pretty hard matchup to debut with, and I think Cummings is going to win, maybe by stoppage. If not, at least Cummings will get the decision here as well. So my official pick is going to be Cummings to defeat Steele.
When you look at it overall, Steele is just not quite on the level of Cummings in terms of pure grappling and even wrestling. Steele is a solid overall fighter with a decent wrestling and good top control, and he's actually been using that wrestling and top control pretty well since making that permanent move to the welterweight division, because at middleweight he was a bit undersized and he was losing fights to some solid UFC vets or just solid overall veterans in the middleweight division. And since dropping down to welterweight, he's been picking up some decent wins. I mean, you got to give him some credit. The guy was beating guys, Ryan Thomas and Dan Hornbuckle and, most recently Chuck O'Neal. So he's going around and he was doing it. But against a guy like Zach Cummings, I just think even though Steele has made a home at 170 with his grappling, he's going to have a lot of trouble with Cummings. Cummings is an excellent grappler, great top control, good wrestling. He's not the quickest guy, but neither is Steele. They're definitely both more slow-paced on the feet, and they just want to get a hold of you and drag you to the canvas. The problem with Steele is he doesn't really threaten the finish nearly as much as Cummings. Cummings doesn't have a ton of power, neither does Steele, but Cummings does have a really solid overall submission game. So I see Cummings being able to out-grapple Steele, and even if Steele gets a takedown, I can see Cummings picking up a sweep or working his way back to the feet and then taking Steele down. And then you also have to factor in that Steele's taking this fight on short notice to make his UFC debut, so it's going to be very difficult for him. And Cummings is definitely an underrated grappler. I'm really surprised that he's not a bigger favorite than he currently is. So I think Zach Cummings will probably not have too much issue with Dominique Steele's ground game, and then he's going to be the one that gets on top. And while Steele is pretty decent when he's in top position and he's able to grind out fights and pick up wins, when he's on his back, it's not nearly as threatening. And the fact that he can't make up for that with anything else in terms of the stand-up game, which is definitely lacking, he's not going to have an advantage on the feet against Cummings either. Cummings isn't that great on the feet, but he should be slightly better there as well. So I see Cummings winning this fight in the clinch as long as he can take inside position. I see Cummings getting top position on the ground, and even if he doesn't, at some point he's going to sweep or get back to his feet and then get top position on the ground. And I see Cummings outworking Steele slightly in the stand-up portion. So I definitely feel this is Zach Cummings' fight to lose, and he bounces back in a big way after that tough loss to Gunnar Nelson. Now dropping down to the women's bantamweight division, we have Jessamine Duke, who is 3-2 with 1 no contest, taking on Elizabeth Phillips, who is 4-3. Now, Nick, what's the MMA oddsmaker's perspective on this one?
I opened Duke -125, the comeback on Phillips -115, so virtually a pick'em. Right now, this has been the most movement on the card from top to bottom. By the way, all lines are courtesy of 5dimes.eu, so make sure you check those guys out. And right now at 5 dimes, it's Phillips -175. The comeback on Duke is +155. So fading Duke is on. That's what everybody's doing here in this spot. And you know what, man? Again, it's another situation where it's hard to not believe in that aspect or that way of thinking, because man, Duke has looked so bad. She's always been a little bit overrated, but in the UFC thus far, I know she lost to Betch Kotea by a clear decision there, and then her last fight against Leslie Smith, I'm not sure what happened, but Smith just ran right through her. Duke looked pretty awful, in my opinion. So Duke's been always a little bit overrated because she did have some buzz before the Ultimate Fighter show. Of course, she's a popular fighter. Obviously, we all know she's training with Ronda Rousey. She's one of the 4 horsewomen, so she has a lot lot of things going for her. But unfortunately for her, it just hasn't panned out as far as her abilities in putting wins together in the UFC thus far. Now that being said, you could say a lot of the same things with Elizabeth Phillips thus far. She's had a couple tough fights, tough split decision losses throughout her UFC career thus far. And she's a pretty decent fighter overall. I mean, she's not bad, but at the same time, she's not that great either. I mean, in my opinion, she's a little bit of a letdown, because her cardio is a little bit of a question mark. She does tend to slow down. Her activity levels tends to slow down as well. And she's just not real dominant in any particular area. I mean, she has decent wrestling. She has decent striking. It can be effective at times as well. She's aware on the ground. So she's got a well-rounded game, but again, she just doesn't really excel and just doesn't dominate anything, or there's no huge concerns when facing Elizabeth Phillips. So I really do believe that this is going to be a close fight, and it's anybody's fight to win or lose, to be honest with you. Duke also has, as amateurs, I know it's dating back a little bit, but Duke already beat Phillips. I mean, she won by submission back in RFA, I believe, a while back. So that's something to consider as well. And Duke does have sneaky good submissions. I mean, on the ground, I think that's one of her best attributes, to be honest with you, is she's so long and she knows how to use that length that she ties you up. She gets you in some problems with using her guard off her back. She does have a sneaky good guillotine choke as well. So Duke has some talent. She's been a letdown. I mean, it is what it is. So I understand people believing in Phillips a little bit more, especially how bad Duke did perform against Leslie Smith. I think it just automatically put the factor of fading Duke in here. But at the same time, I really do think Duke has some advantages in this fight. On the feet, it's going to be close. I think even though Duke is not really well known for her knockout power, she does have a good clinch game. She is long again on the feet. She could be effective, especially when Elizabeth Phillips starts slowing down a little bit. I think that maybe Duke could be a little bit busier on the feet. And then again, on the grounds, it's going to be close, but you got to give the edge to Duke, even though she'd probably be on her back there as well. So a tough fight. I don't really agree with the line right now being minus 175 for Phillips. I think that's maybe a little bit too much disrespect for Duke, but it is a toss-up fight. But I've been honestly going back and forth on this. I would normally lean a little bit more towards Phillips in this spot. But to be honest with you, I'm going to go against the grain here, and I think I am going to pick Jessamyn Duke because I think that, again, she has some confidence coming in. She needs to rebound here and get a win. A lot of pressure with both of these ladies on this fight. I do think that Duke probably has a better skill set. Doesn't mean she's going to win the fight. I could change my mind at weigh-ins. This is one of those situations here as well, but I am going to lean a little bit more toward Duke. I know that's crazy. I can't believe I'm saying it myself because she's looked so bad, but I am going to pick Jessamyn Duke to defeat Elizabeth Phillips.
Yeah, neither of these girls have looked good in their last two UFC fights respectively, although Phillips did tag Letourneau in her UFC debut pretty badly in the first round. She just ran out of steam and then ended up getting outstruck over the next two rounds. And what makes that look especially bad is the fact that Letourneau ended up dropping down to the strawweight division, 20 full pounds, and going to a new division and then picking up a win down there. So she basically got beaten by a strawweight in her UFC debut. And Phillips is a legitimate 135er. She is big. She's very muscular. So man, the fact that she wasn't able to outmuscle her opponent there is definitely a bit scary. Now, in her next fight against Dudiva, I mean, it could have gone either way. It was close, but again, Phillips failed to impress. And even though she probably could have and should have gotten that decision, it wasn't like a situation where you went, oh man, she got robbed. Because again, she's just there. She's not doing enough. She has okay wrestling. She has okay striking. She's just not really good anywhere. And with Duke, at one point, she was like a really highly rated prospect in the bantamweight division. I mean, she came on, burst onto the scene, looked pretty good in her first couple fights, making her debuts with Invicta. It's just she ran into some really tough opponents. I mean, Miriam Nakamoto put her away. That ended up being a no contest. And then, Betchko Heya, really nasty fighter. It was the Leslie Smith fight that's the most damning for Duke, where she just came out, didn't use that reach that she has. She is definitely the tallest, longest fighter in the women's bantamweight division. And then Smith just unloaded a huge combinations on her and just made her wilt against the fence. Now, that's not going to happen against Phillips. She's just not that type of fighter. She's not that good of a striker. She does not throw a lot of punches together in combination. So Duke does not have to worry about that. Phillips probably is the better wrestler of the two. So that's one thing Duke will have to keep her eyes open for is, Phillips shooting in for a takedown. But Phillips really doesn't have that much of a submission game either. So even if Phillips does pick up the takedown, Duke's actually pretty dangerous off of her back. She has those really long limbs. I'd say her best part of her game is probably her submissions. Duke has really good triangle chokes, arm bars off of her back, and she's pulled them off before. And that's actually one of her most recent wins was in Invicta. She had her opponent on top of her. She pulls off an armbar. So I can see Duke submitting Elizabeth Phillips. If you actually go back to their amateur careers, she did submit Phillips in her last amateur fight before turning pro. So these girls have squared off before, and Duke did get the better of it. Now, unfortunately, there's no video of it, so I really wasn't able to see how she was able to do it. I just know that she did. But I think that does have to give Jessamine Duke a bit of confidence. And Duke does have the one UFC win if you count her debut against Peggy Morgan on the finale for The Ultimate Fighter Season 18. So at least she knows she can go out there and win against a UFC caliber fighter. But against somebody like Phillips, who is just about as low tier as you get in the bantamweight division, I think Duke's actually in a decent spot here. My big problem with Duke has been all the work she's been putting in over at Ronda's gym. They've kind of tried to change the way she fights. She used to be a lot more dangerous on the inside because she used good knees and elbows, and she was good in the clinch. And now they're trying to get her to work more on the outside, and she just hasn't been able to adjust. So maybe this long layoff will actually benefit her so that she's able to show those developments and improve, because she is still pretty young in the sport. I mean, she made her UFC debut on just her third professional fight. So I expect Duke to turn it around here a little bit. And while Phillips is a good athlete, she just doesn't present that much else other than a little bit of power. And I think Duke can withstand that power. So I expect Duke to get a little bit of the better on the feet, although neither of them are that impressive there. And Duke should be the better grappler of the two, even though Phillips probably has better wrestling. So I see Duke winning this fight. I'm surprised the lines have shifted the way it has. I think it's just more anti-four horsewoman or something. But I expect Jessamine Duke to not just win, but possibly finish Elizabeth Phillips with a submission if she drags this fight to the ground. So Jessamine Duke is my pick. Now moving up to the lightweight division, we have Ramsey Nijem, who is 10-4, taking on Andrew Holbrook, who is 9-0. Now, Nick, where did you open this fight, and how has the public shifted things so far?
I opened Nijem minus 180, the comeback on Holbrook plus 140, and this line has dropped quite a bit. It's now Nijem minus 130, the comeback on Holbrook is plus 110. So not a lot of respect really towards Nijem in this fight, because he is almost at pick with a debuting prospect in Holbrook. And getting into Holbrook right now, actually, he's a former college wrestler. He's got some amateur boxing experience as well. He trains out of a decent camp in Indy with Chris Lytle and crew. So, he's got a well-rounded skill set, because Chris Lytle is just a beast everywhere. I mean, one of my all-time favorite fighters, no doubt about it. But that being said, Holbrook's still raw, still developing, and this is a big step up in competition for Holbrook in fighting a guy like Nijem. Holbrook's more of a grappling-based fighter. He has a powerful frame for sure. On the feet, he's a bit predictable, though, at times, slow, but he does have some power to go along with that. Now, his punches are also thrown a bit wide, and he leaves himself open for counterattack on the feet, so that defensively he still needs to up his game a little bit and be a little bit tighter. And then on the ground, I've also noticed, for having that wrestling background, he does go for takedowns, but a lot of times he's more of a counter grappler. He waits for the person to obviously, look to exchange or to initiate ground exchange, and he looks to counter that with his submission game, because that's where he's the best at, honestly. It's his subs. He's won all 9 of his fights by submission. And he's got decent technique to go along with power. So he gets around your neck. He's the type of fighter that can definitely finish the fight. I mean, you can't get out of a bad spot with a guy like that. So Nijem has to be careful, because we've seen some bad fight IQ at times displayed by Nijem. But honestly, besides that, I really don't think Holbrook has much to offer in this fight for Nijem. Nijem is also an outstanding wrestler, as we all know. He's actually made a lot of strides. I think he's getting better. I mean, he's still raw. He came from the Ultimate Fighter with the high expectations, and he's kind of disappointed at times. And I think that's why people are fading him a little bit, because his strike defense on the feet is a little suspect, where it leads him to get knocked out. I mean, his chin is not the strongest, but he is getting a little bit better in those areas. He is getting a little bit better with his striking game offensively, at least, that he can do some damage. I mean, he throws with some power on the feet, even though he's more known for his wrestling and his grappling game as well. So he's not one to take lightly on the feet either, even though he is defensively flawed a little bit. And then, of course, on the ground, I think Nijum is a outstanding grappler. As he has really good wrestling. He could dictate and control where the fight goes a lot of times. And I think he is actually going to have the wrestling advantage over Holbrook on the ground as well. So really what it comes down to here, in my opinion, I think on the feet, Nijum is going to be the better striker. I think on the ground, Nijum is going to be the better wrestler. I think if Nijum does not get submitted by Holbrook, he's going to win the fight. This is, again, a big step up in competition for Holbrook. So even though he's a powerful guy and a decent prospect, I still think Nijum is ahead of him right now at this point. He has a UFC experience to go along with it. So if he can maintain a decent fight IQ here, he's going to win the fight. So honestly, all the early action on Holbrook, yes, he can win, and he can win by submission. And I wouldn't be shocked if that happens, if Nijum sticks his head in and gets caught. Yes, that is very possible. But to be honest with you, I think it's a little bit disrespect going towards Nijum. And I think Nijum is the better fighter, and he's probably going to get the job done here. So my official pick is going to be Nijum. I think he could win this fight. If he gets dominant position on the ground, he can win by stoppage. If not, I think he can also win on the cards by decision. I honestly compared this fight a little bit to the Justin Edwards fight for Nijum. I mean, Edwards is a very well-rounded fighter as well. He has a lot of similar attributes to Holbrook, but honestly, Holbrook is not quite as good as Edwards, and Nijum was able to, it was competitive in that fight with Edwards for sure, but he was able to get that job done. So I think he's going to be able to, have honestly an easier time if he can stay out of that, those chokes from Holbrook. So my official pick is Nijum, and at minus 130, it's definitely a head scratcher because I do think the line should be up a little bit more.
Yeah, Andrew Holbrook is a pretty good fighter out of Indiana, but that's the problem, is he hasn't even left Indiana yet. Now, granted, he's not going far, going over to Chicago, but this is a huge jump for him going from the Indiana regional scene to the UFC. Now, he does train at a decent gym, working with the guys like Chris Lytle and stuff, but man, he's a fighter that relies almost exclusively on getting fights to the ground with his wrestling, although he was, a collegiate wrestler. He's not a bad wrestler. And then submitting his opponent. And those are the type of fighters that usually have the most trouble in the UFC, because if they don't get a fight to the ground, they're usually in bad shape. Now, Holbrook is not a terrible striker. He has some power, but he does not throw with a high volume or combinations or much technique at all. And he does have decent head kicks. So that's actually how he was able to finish his last fight. It was his first opponent that had a decent wrestling background, and he could not get them to the ground. And then he smacked him with a head kick, hurt him, and then submitted him. So maybe that's how he beats Ramsey Nijum, because I don't see him taking Ramsey Nijum down. Nijum has an excellent wrestling base in his own. And honestly, if anybody's getting a takedown in this fight, it's Nijum. And Holbrook, while he does have those head kicks, Nijum, he doesn't have the greatest striking defense. He's still a bit sloppy on the feet. He definitely does not have a great chin, and he does have the occasional issues with just charging forward and just landing in something, like when he charged forward right into a James Vick guillotine choke, or just walked right into a Tony Ferguson knockout punch. So Nijum does have his issues on the feet, but overall, he should be the better striker here against Holbrook. So unless Holbrook drops him with a head kick or something, or Nijum walks right into a big overhand right or something, I expect Nijum to get the better on the feet. Now, in terms of the ground game, Holbrook is a good wrestler, but Nijum's a better wrestler, and he's proven it against some pretty good fighters in the UFC. I mean, he actually finished Beneil Dariush, who in my opinion is a fringe top 15 or even a legit top 15 lightweight in the UFC at this point. So, I mean, that was really, really impressive. Now, obviously, Nijum has had his faults. I mean, he did get knocked out by Carlos Diego Ferreira in his last fight, and that was about 11 months ago. So that is something of a concern, because he hasn't fought in a while. But, I mean, he's still a guy that was improving. And Nijum's biggest strength is when he gets on top of you. I mean, his ground and pound is ferocious, and he's finished multiple fights that way. And if he gets on top of Holbrook, I don't see Holbrook pulling off any miracle sweeps or anything. He's not that great unless he's in top position, working over his opponents with a little bit of punches and then trying to submit them. I'd be very interested to see how Holbrook responds if he does get put on his back, because Nijum is so good from top position with that control, and he doesn't just lay on you. He does a really good job of punishing you there, and he can finish fights. So I think Holbrook, while he's a decent prospect, those Indiana guys just haven't quite made that leap, especially recently in the UFC. I mean, you saw guys like Garrett Whiteley, who I think was out of Holbrook's gym, come to the UFC and just get slaughtered. So I think Nijum is going to be able to overwhelm Holbrook a little bit with his pace on the feet, with his takedowns, and actually getting Holbrook on his back, and then with that ground and pound. Nijum is a bit underrated in my opinion, and I think this is definitely his fight to lose, and I'm surprised that he's at such a low price already. So I'm picking Ramsey Nijum. Now sticking with the lightweight division, we have Darren Cruikshank, who is 16-6 with 1 no contest, taking on James Krause, who is 21-7. Now, Nick, what's the MMA oddsmaker's perspective on this one?
Cruikshank opens minus 215. The comeback on Krause plus 165. And all action coming in on Krause early on. From plus 165, the dog is now plus 130 on Krause. So Cruikshank is minus 150. So again, more support coming in on Krause. And you know what? I can understand it a little bit because for those of you guys that have been listening to me talk about Cruikshank on podcasts before know that, I've faded him at times for sure and underestimating the guy definitely in a few of his fights. Cruikshank's a very solid fighter, but I do see some flaws in his games, and that's one of the reasons why. And I think that all the early action coming in thus far on Krause is, again, along that line. I mean, Krause is a very talented fighter. He's long for the weight class. He's going to have a little bit of reach over Cruikshank right now. But he's a complete offensive fighter, meaning he can definitely beat you up on the feet. He mixes everything up well with his kickboxing. He has a good clinch game to go along with it. And on the ground, Krause, offensive wrestling is not the greatest. He does get put on his back. His takedown defense not the greatest either. But he does have really good BJJ. He's got good submission skill. He's got good fight IQ as well. He's a finisher. So he's capable of finishing the fight on the feet. He's capable of finishing the fight on the ground. And again, Cruikshank does definitely have some flaws. I mean, on the feet, I think offensively, Cruikshank is outstanding. He mixes everything up well. He's going to have a speed advantage here. He's going to have a pure power advantage over Krause as well. But defensively, again, I don't trust his chin all the way. He's only been officially knocked out once in his career thus far. But that being said, he has been tagged. He's been rocked. He actually got knocked out on the Ultimate Fighter as well. So Cruikshank's chin's probably not as good as we're all making it out to be a little bit. And then again, I think Cruikshank's sub-defense is concerned as well. I mean, if this fight does hit the ground, which Cruikshank has a wrestling advantage in this fight over Krause, so he will probably look for a takedown or two along the way. He has to be careful because he has been submitted, and that seems to be one of his flaws. So Krause is capable of winning this on the floor. He's capable of possibly winning this on the feet as well. But at the same time, I do think it's Cruikshank's fight to win or lose because, again, he is going to be an effective striker. If you look back to the Ultimate Fighter season that Krause was on, actually, he had a lot of problems with a striker named Justin Lawrence. Most of you guys know that as well. Lawrence was able to use his speed, use his power, and make life miserable for Krause. I think Cruikshank is a similar type of fighter on the feet a little bit, where he can move around and with his unorthodox angles and his speed and his power, he's going to give Krause some problems on the feet as well. So I do think it's his fight to win or lose. He has a wrestling advantage, like I mentioned. He can control where the fight takes place. He could be the more effective striker at times as well. So if he doesn't get caught in a submission or anything stupid, I think he wins this fight. So I am going to go with Cruikshank to win. It's definitely going to be an entertaining fight because both these guys are capable of finishing any moment, but at the same time, I can also see it hit the scorecard. So my official pick is going to be Cruikshank to get the W here.
Yeah, this is definitely an evenly matched fight on the feet. Krause is definitely the taller, longer guy, and if he can use that, then he's going to be in good shape because Cruikshank does not have a great chin. Honestly, neither of them have great chins, although Cruikshank's is probably worse. But what really helps Cruikshank is his ability to mix up the striking and wrestling. Obviously, the wrestling didn't help him that much in his last fight because he shot in on Beneil Dariush and then got submitted. But I don't think he gets submitted if he shoots in on James Krause, and Krause does not have great wrestling. And, I mean, he got taken down by a one-legged Jamie Varner. So I think if Cruikshank wants to take this down, he can. And on the feet, Cruikshank will have the better footwork. He's the quicker guy that likes to stay on the outside. He does have a good kicking game. Krause, while he's long and he does do some unique things, I mean, that UFC debut win over Sam Stout was super impressive, but he has not shown that much lately. I mean, honestly, he's been on a pretty bad losing streak, and I just don't see him turning it around here. Masvidal and Lazaro are good fighters, and they were able to win. And the Lazaro fight was close. I'll give Krause that. But unless Krause knocks Cruikshank out, I don't see him outworking Cruikshank. I don't see him out-kicking Cruikshank, and I don't see him out-wrestling Cruikshank. So basically he has a submitter's chance and maybe a puncher's chance. But other than that, I think it's going to be a little bit too much for him. So I got to side with Cruikshank here. Now, Reed, what do the numbers tell us for this one?
Well, there's definitely a power mismatch in the striking, but when it comes to pace, actually, Krause could be able to simply outwork and push Cruikshank going backwards, which is dangerous for a guy who likes to rely on his kicks so much. So if it does stay standing, which it probably should, because Cruikshank, I think, has a better takedown offense and defense, and he's probably not going to be initiating a lot of takedowns here. If he wants to take it down, Krause's defense, as you guys mentioned, is not very good at all. His takedown defense is only 25%, which is pretty bad. But Cruikshank, he's definitely not a lock to try to take this down. They could stand and trade. You've got Krause being the longer guy, which should help. He's also the higher paced guy on average. Now, part of that is because Cruikshank does rely on kicks, and you just can't fire off as many of those as you can with your hands. His accuracy is also low. Again, that's deflated because of his kicks. But where you see the power in his knockdowns, he has 5 knockdowns to date, a very high knockdown rate, more than twice the division average. And meanwhile, James Krause has been dropped 3 times. Now, all of those did not result in knockouts. He was able to recover on some of them, but that's dangerous for a guy facing a guy who loves to throw a lot of kicks. Especially to the body. That could be an issue. As James Krause, I think he took one to the body against Bobby Green, and that put him away. So there are a lot of risks here for Krause, but if he doesn't get knocked out, this should be more competitive. So it's harder to pick. I'm going to lean with Cruikshank here. If he finds that he's not landing the big kick and maybe he's just getting out hustled, he could mix in his wrestling. He has to be careful, obviously. But he has more ways to win this. And Krause, although he has some positive signs here with the size and the pace, the chin to power matchup is not good. And I think just Cruikshank generally just has a bit more experience at this high level in the UFC. So I think he's going to implement a sound game plan.
All right. Excellent. Thanks, Reed. Now dropping down to the bantamweight division and kicking off the Fox prelims, we have Eddie Wineland, who is 21-10-1, taking on Brian Caraway, who is 19-8. Now, Nick, where did you open this fight, and how has the public shifted things so far?
I opened Wineland minus 170, the comeback on Caraway plus 130, and right now, looking over at 5 dimes, it is Wineland minus 140, the comeback on Caraway plus 120. So 10 cents less and worse on the dog right now on Caraway. So not a huge movement, but at the same time, more people are supporting Caraway, which is a little surprising to me. Caraway is definitely earning some respect recently throughout his UFC career, because at the beginning, he was the type of fighter that honestly got a little bit too much disrespect. A lot of people didn't I think understand how good this guy could be, or his skill set with his wrestling, with the submission game, and the work he was putting in. But now it's showing. I mean, he's had some impressive performances. By far, he's faced very solid competition, and the guy keeps on improving. Mentally, I think was a big flaw in Caraway's game for a long time as well. I think self-confidence was a big issue, but now, I mean, obviously he's been training with the proper individuals, with Extreme Couture, with the Alpha Male crew. Everything, throughout his career has helped him get to this point. He's a confident fighter these days, and he has a skill set to make life miserable for a lot of people, because he has underrated wrestling, and then, of course, I mean, his submission game is definitely one of the best at bantamweight for sure. So Caraway's legit, no doubt about it. He keeps on improving his stand-up game as well, and I think, honestly, even though it was a unanimous decision loss to Asuncao in his last fight, he was really game, and Asuncao is in line for a title shot. So Caraway's right there. I mean, it's impressive, really. But at the same time, now he's facing the guy that's been to the top, and he got that title shot in Wineland. And Wineland is a type of fighter that is well known for being a warrior, honestly. I mean, his knockouts and his striking are what highlights his resume for sure. The guy is just a great finisher, a great puncher. He's fun to watch on the feet. He's got the type of wrestling and takedown defense that hard to get him to the floor and control him a little bit. But if there are any flaws in Wineland's game, it's definitely that sub-defense. If you look back, I know it's been a little while, but look back at his loss to Ronnie Yaya back, I believe it was like in 2009 or so. Yaya was able to take his back relatively quick and submit him relatively quick. So I think that's the kind of game plan Caraway has to implement here. It might not be easy doing that, but I think Caraway's a sneaky good fighter when it comes to, catching people or taking people's back or getting the fight to the floor a little bit. He doesn't have to use, just his orthodox wrestling or, your typical wrestling. I think he can, up against a cage, find his way to, maneuver and, like I said, take, Wineland's back or do something like that. So Wineland's gonna have to be cautious and he's gonna have to avoid being submitted here. If he does that though, it is Wineland's fight to win or lose, honestly. So I do think that he's definitely the better striker on the feet. He's gonna present some serious problems to Caraway if Caraway cannot, get this fight where he wants it underground. Even though Caraway has improved the stand-up game, he's still not on the level of Wineland. I mean, Wineland has that killer instinct on the feet. He's got that crazy knockout power, and I think that he could do some serious damage along the way. So, seems like everybody's expecting Caraway to win by submission here against Wineland. I think that is definitely a possibility, but I'm actually going to go the other way. I'm going to pick Wineland to win this fight. I think it is his fight to win or lose. I know that KO loss he's coming off of to Eduardo was really surprising in some ways and disappointing, so we could see the start of a bit of a decline with Wineland, but I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt here, and I think that he still has some fights left in him that he's going to perform and look well, and I think this is probably one of them. So my official pick is going to be Wineland, probably to win by decision, but there's also a chance that Wineland actually finishes Caraway on the feet as well.
Yeah, this fight's tricky. I mean, it's basically a striker versus grappler matchup, and when Caraway is able to get bites to the ground, he wins them. I mean, you saw what happened when he was able to get Johnny Bedford to the ground. He submitted him. When he got Eric Perez to the ground, he put him away. When he isn't able to do that, like against Rafael Sunsao, he just gets outstruck a little bit and he'll lose. And Eddie Wineland is definitely the better striker here, although Caraway is very tough, so he can take some shots in order to get inside and try to close the distance and drag this to the ground. Now, Wineland's takedown defense isn't half bad. I mean, really the only guy that's been able to completely dominate him with wrestling was Uriah Faber, and even then that fight was pretty tough and close. So it's not going to be easy for Brian Caraway to win this fight if he, by taking it to the ground. He can't just telegraph the takedowns because he's not an explosive wrestler or anything. Now, in terms of the stand-up, Eddie Wineland has a lot of power in the bantamweight division, one of the more powerful strikers overall. But man, I did not see that last fight coming against Eduardo where he got just knocked out cold. And, 2 fights before that, Hayden Barao kicked him right in the face and knocked him out. So he could definitely be in a bit of a decline, and he has not fought now in about 14 months. So that's another thing you absolutely have to consider heading into this fight is the long layoff, coming off of a tough knockout loss, 2 knockouts in his last 3 fights. Now, Caraway's not the guy that's going to take advantage of the knockouts because, he really doesn't knock out anybody. On the feet, Caraway really just tries to control the pace and just set you up to get that fight to the ground. And it's not going to be easy, but I think if Caraway can get this fight to the clinch or anywhere not in pure open space, he's got a shot. And if he can get this fight to the ground, I'm not saying he's going to submit Wineland because Wineland's really a solid overall guy, and he hasn't been submitted in a long time. But I do think Caraway, he could win 2 out of 3 rounds here, especially with how rusty Wineland is. Now, Caraway hasn't fought since October of last year either, but it's still not quite nearly as long of the layoff as Wineland. And I think Caraway still has enough left in the tank here. And with Wineland seemingly on a bit of a decline, granted against some pretty good guys, but I think this is Caraway's fight to lose. So I think Caraway closes the distance, I think he drags him to the ground, and I think he wins. So my pick is going to be Brian Caraway. Now, Reed, what do the numbers tell us for this one?
Well, the numbers definitely back up the story here. This is going to be a striker versus grappler matchup. Wineland's stats are very good. He does have all those knockdowns, 7 career knockdowns under Zuffa. That's at a very high rate, whereas Caraway has yet to score a knockdown, and his power striking accuracy is pretty low anyway, so that's one reason why. And even though he matches the pace of his opponents on the feet, he is getting tagged up. Caraway has very bad head strike defense, whereas Wineland is, a normal accuracy, very high power, but also good defense. So When it comes to technical striking, Wineland definitely has the advantages on the feet. On the ground, completely different story. Caraway is going for lots and lots of takedowns, nearly twice the average rate, whereas Wineland has barely attempted any. And Caraway is landing those at an average pace, although it's more of a situation where he just keeps going until he gets it down. And he has generally controlled his opponents on the mat and thrown up a lot of submissions. Wineland, to his credit, has faced a lot of takedowns, 42 of them. And his takedown defense at 81% is actually really high. It's as high as Caraway's. I actually have the same defensive rate, but Wineland is facing a lot more takedown attempts because of his striking. People are trying to get it off the feet to stay away from his strength and put him at his weakness. So generally he has been controlled because he's not initiating the wrestling. So do we believe that Caraway can survive on his feet long enough to get it to the ground? The back and forth between who wins and striker grappler it's gone up and down over the years. Caraway, I think he eventually gets it there. Does he get a submission? I don't know. He really has to get a couple takedowns probably per round to win a decision. It's the question of, does he find his way to the back and get the RNC like he has so many times before? Because basically, if he doesn't get the submission in the UFC, he hasn't won. His 2 losses were by decision. So, this is a really tough one to call. I'm not picking this one with any confidence. I do like Eddie Wineland's chances to know that Caraway is going to be going after these takedowns and, not pinpoint accuracy, but just outpointing Caraway on the way in, dinging him up, maybe even cutting him, hurting him. That's also going to win you around. So this is a really close one to call. I'm not picking it either way. If I had to lean one way or the other, I might go Wineland, but not with any confidence.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Reed. Now moving up to the welterweight division, we have Kenny Robertson, who is 15-3, taking on Ben Saunders, who is 18-6-2. Now, Nick, what's the MMA odds maker's perspective on this one?
I've been Saunders minus 155, the comeback on Robertson plus 115. And right now, looking over at the line at 5 times, it is Robertson minus 115. The comeback on Saunders is minus 105. Looking at the non-best screen across the board, it looks like it's settled basically at a pick 'em minus 110 out there either way. So it'll be around that pick 'em spot, I'm sure, throughout until fight day. It's going to be pretty close. Then we'll see some action one way or the other. When a little bit of heavier bets start coming in and the limits, of course, are increased. So this is an interesting fight. And I'm a little upset at those of you guys that came in on Robertson early on, to be honest with you, because there's been so much hype outside of the top tier fighters that Ben Saunders faces. He's always a pretty decent favorite. He's the popular fighter. Of course, a lot of that has to do with his abilities because he's able to finish the fight on the feet. I mean, he's got a nasty clinch game. He's long, obviously, for the weight class. He has really good striking. He mixes in his kicks well with his punches, everything. Offensively, watching Saunders fight is definitely a thing of beauty. I mean, it's really fun to watch him fight. He brings it. Even on the ground, he's more than capable of finishing his opponents by submission. I mean, if you just look at his fight against Heatherly, I'm going to not even consider that fight with Riggs. I mean, it was just kind of a flukish type of thing with Joe Riggs. But before that, I mean, his submission omoplata win over Heatherly. That tells you what kind of ability this guy has. And so he's hard to deal with everywhere the fight takes place. He's a really good finisher, a smart fight IQ. He's hard to finish, minus his suspect chin. That's one flaw that I think hinders Sanders a little bit, is on the feet against talented strikers with knockout power that are able to keep the fight upright. He doesn't fare as well sometimes. So that is a concern with Saunders, for sure. But at the same time, he has the ability to make life miserable for his opponents. Now, Robertson, on the other hand, this is why I'm a little mad, because I honestly wanted to play Robertson at a plus money myself. So I don't blame you guys for coming in and taking Robertson at this spot. I just figured that the hype and the public would generally go towards Saunders a little bit more in this situation, but not the case. Robertson is getting some respect, and he deserves it, to be honest with you, because he has a complete game in his own right. I think Robertson, his stand-up game is getting a little bit better. Obviously, he's proven that by his impressive win. I mean, it was a little bit surprising, but he knocked out Aliyev in his last fight. But before that, I mean, he was impressive in doing what he does best against guys that are a little bit dangerous on the feet or capable of finishing fights. Against Alcantara, for example, he smothered him, was able to grind out a decision win. And that's the ability that Robertson has. He also has really outstanding jiu-jitsu. He's capable of submitting fighters on the ground, but not just that. He has wrestling to go along with it. So if he's not finishing the fight, he could at least control the fight, get some takedowns, drop some ground and pound a little bit, and just kind of outpoint his opponents and grind out a win. So Robertson is capable of doing that as well. So I think that's what he's going to implement here against Saunders, because Saunders, throughout his career, he's obviously had some problems against good wrestlers that have been able to put him on his back and avoid getting submitted. So the early action coming in on Robertson, I guarantee, is a lot to do with that. A lot of people believe out there that Robertson is going to be able to get this fight to the floor and at least grind Saunders out for 3 rounds. And I think that's probably the case here. I think Saunders, obviously, you got to be careful with him because, again, he's very talented, but I do think that Robertson is going to be able to at least stifle the submission attempts, control Saunders on the ground a little bit, and then again outpoint him and get a decision win. Now on the feet though, can't even count out the possibility that both these guys are definitely sluggers and they can both finish the fight by knockout. So with questionable chins either way, especially Saunders having the more questionable chin, there is also a path to victory with Robertson, especially coming off that impressive knockout win over Aliyev. Maybe he finishes on the feet as well. So more ways to win, I think, for Robertson here. If it hits the scorecards, I'd be surprised if Saunders gets the W. So you kind of have to lean with Robertson. So I agree with the early action coming in his way, and I'm going to pick him myself.
Yeah, this is definitely an intriguing matchup. Ben Saunders is at his absolute best when he's either working his submission game, usually off of his back actually, or when he's in the clinch. I mean, his clinch is one of the most feared things in MMA. When he gets guys against the fence or just that close, he's able to just unload with Muay Thai, nasty elbows, great knees, very punishing fighter. Who can forget his performance against Marcus Davis with those knees? Now, in his UFC career so far, at least the second time around, he hasn't done that much, although he's still been able to walk away with 2 first-round finishes. The fight against Chris Heatherly, he pulled off the first omoplata in UFC history, which was very impressive, but Chris Heatherly is not a UFC caliber fighter. And then Joe Riggs just hurt himself on a takedown. So we really haven't seen enough to know just at what level of Ben Saunders we're going to be getting here. Now, Kenny Robertson, on the other hand, he has looked phenomenal. I mean, he's on a solid 3-fight winning streak, and especially the level of guys he's been beating. I mean, he's going out there and he's just taking care of business. I've been very, very impressed with his performances. Now, the one thing that does scare me is he did get outstruck by Sean Pearson and lost a decision. Granted, that was 2 years ago, but if he's gets outstruck by Sean Pearson, maybe he does get outstruck by Ben Saunders over the course of a 3-round fight if he can't get this fight to the ground. Now, Saunders isn't great in open space. He's okay. He's definitely more dangerous in the clinch, but Robertson actually showcased improved stand-up in his last fight with that first-round knockout of Sultan Aliyev. So you got to give him a little bit of props there for continuing to develop. Now, where this fight's really going to be decided almost 100% is the wrestling and takedowns, because Robertson does have a big-time wrestling advantage in this fight, and if he can drag Ben Saunders to the ground and stay on top of him, he probably will win. The big thing is, can he get Saunders to the ground, which I think is a yes, and can he not get submitted if he does? Because Saunders has a very nasty rubber guard game from his back where he is constantly threatening with triangle chokes, omoplatas, sweeps, kimuras. I mean, he is just all over the place. And it's not going to be easy, but I think Robertson has a very underrated ground game in his own right. I mean, he pulled off a really impressive submission earlier in his UFC career. So I think this is Robertson's fight to lose, as long as he doesn't just get stuck in the clinch on a failed takedown attempt against Saunders and eating knees and elbows, or if he doesn't fall into a submission attempt on a takedown. He should be in good shape here and potentially win a decision or maybe even get a finish. Saunders doesn't have a great chin. And while Robertson, I didn't think he had a lot of power. I mean, he showed it in his last fight. So if he can load up with some ground strikes, he could put Saunders away as well. So I'm picking Kenny Robertson here. Now, Reed, what do the numbers tell us for this one?
Well, I don't feel like I have a great feel for Kenny Robertson, but some of the stats are lining up with the points that you guys are making. First of all, Ben Saunders is very active in the clinch, and he is very accurate. Kenny Robertson attempts a lot of takedowns. He's just not very accurate with them, and I think that's because he's forcing them a lot. So a lot of these are shooting takedowns from a distance, and he's just not landing them. But if he is willing to clinch with Ben Saunders and can survive that clinch, his success rate could go way up, and his time and control per takedown is over 2.5 minutes. So Kenny Robertson does know how to put someone on their back and keep them there. The threat, obviously, with Ben Saunders, he does have pretty active submissions. Statistically, it's not very high, but anecdotally, we saw him pull off that unbelievable submission against Heatherly. As you pointed out, maybe not fully UFC competition, but he does seem to be active there. So the numbers aren't as impressive for Saunders as I actually expected them to be here. And when they're going toe to toe, Saunders does have the reach advantage, but Robertson has actually been very accurate with his power hand, and he's throwing a very high mix of power strikes. He's not really using his jab a lot. He's landing his power hand with a lot of accuracy. So that is a threat. Both guys have scored knockdowns. Both guys have been dropped. And pace-wise, toe-to-toe, they're actually pretty even. Robertson's defense is probably a liability there. He does get hit a lot, and Saunders is a bit more evasive. So pure stand-up striking, close, edge goes to Saunders on the ground. Again, there's some scenarios here that have to play out, but Robertson is fully capable of planting Saunders on his back and keeping him there. And if he can stay out of trouble, that's probably what gets him through. Not a confident pick, but I would lean Robertson here.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Reed. Now dropping down to the lightweight division, we have Jim Miller, who is 24-6 with 1 no contest, taking on Danny Castillo, who is 17-8. Now, Nick, where did you open this fight, and how has the public shifted things so far?
Up in Miller minus 160, the comeback on Castillo plus 120. And right now looking over the line at 5 times, it is Miller minus 135, the comeback on Castillo plus 115. So 5-cent movement on the dog again. Line margins tighten up a little bit. So a little bit of two-way action coming in for both of these guys. And I'm not surprised at all here because you got two really similar fighters, honestly. Both wrestlers have that wrestling background, both capable of getting the fight to the floor in most cases when they want, grinding out their opponents. Both have some power on the feet, capable of knocking out their opponents. I think what differentiates them the most is honestly Miller's jiu-jitsu game is far better than Castillo's. So he has that going for him, definitely has an edge there. I should mention right away as well that Miller is taking this fight on a little bit short notice. He's replacing Hobolov. Hobolov was originally supposed to face Castillo, of course. So Miller's going to be game. He's going to step in on a little bit short notice, which I don't think is going to hinder him too bad in this spot. It's stylistically, it's a pretty good fight, and it's going to be a close fight. I mean, the odds indicate that, and I expect it to play out this way. And it's kind of tough to see who's going to have the upper hand here because both of them have had some up and down performances recently, honestly. Starting off with Castillo, I guess, first. I mean, honestly, I think he's got a little bit of a speed advantage over Miller. His boxing on the feet, Castillo is really good. He's got some underrated power on the feet as well. And again, he's got a good wrestling game to go along with it. He did get knocked out midway through basically round 2 against Felder in his last fight. But Felder has incredible knockout power. We'll talk about him later on, of course, on this card as well. But so honestly, I could give him a pass a little bit because Felder would knock out a lot of people, and he will continue to knock out a lot of people in lightweight division. But what impressed me the most about Castillo was that fight with Tony Ferguson. I mean, he fought a guy that was really climbing towards the top of the lightweight division, a guy that had a lot of buzz around him, a lot of momentum going for him. And honestly, a lot of people believe Castillo should have beat Ferguson because he controlled most of that fight. And it's hard to say that he didn't. I mean, it was a close competitive fight for sure, but he did have more top control, and you could see a lot of judges scoring it that way. So he could have a win over a stud like Ferguson on his resume, before the Felder loss. So that says a lot. I think Castillo is he's 35 years old now, so he's getting to that spot where you got to be a little bit concerned because age is playing a factor here as well. But he's at the same time mentally and as far as, I think fight IQ and his overall MMA game, I think he's never been better, to be honest with you. So there are a lot of good things with Castillo, but this fight against Miller is definitely going to be a test, and it's going to be a tough one because Jim Miller, I think, has the ability again on the feet. He might not be as fast as Castillo, but he does have some punching power to go along with it. His hands have always been a little bit underrated. I think Miller has a better chin out of the two. Castillo's always been a little bit suspect in that area as well. So he's got the tougher chin. He's got knockout power on the feet. And then And if the fight does hit the floor, it's going to be close. But I do think, again, the advantage lies with Miller because his jiu-jitsu game is incredible. And Castillo has been submitted in the past and against a guy that can end the fight above average, way above average on the ground, which Miller is. I mean, look, he's obviously one of the guys that even finished Oliveira, and we all know how good Oliveira can be on the ground, but different situation, different weight class at this time. I realize that, but still, that's impressive. And Miller's finished a lot of guys throughout his UFC career that way. So stud versus stud here, veteran versus veteran here. Miller, believe it or not, even though fight years he's a little bit older than 31, but he's only still 31 years old, so he's going to have a little bit of youth advantage over Castillo. But I think you throw that out the window as well because both these guys have been in so many wars. So a toss-up type of fight. I'm going to lean a little bit towards Jim Miller more, because I do think that he does have the better chin. I think if the fight hits the ground and they get into some scrambles, I think Miller's going to be better in that situation as well. So just a very slight lean to Miller because I think he's just a little bit more dependable. And I think that he has more tools capable of winning this fight. So that's why I'm leaning that way. But we're going to see an awesome fight, a very competitive back and forth type of fight here, I expect. But I am going to lean towards Miller.
Yeah, this is a situation where you have a grappler in Danny Castillo pretty much purely wants to take this fight to the ground, and then a guy in Jim Miller who's able to do just about everything. So Miller is definitely the better boxer here. Castillo isn't a bad striker. He has good power with a nasty overhand right. His problem is he just can't trade for punch with most people because his chin is so bad. So against Miller, I think that while Castillo probably has the power advantage, Miller is definitely the more durable guy. And if they start trading blow for blow, at some point, Miller's going to crack Castillo and put him out. Now, in terms of the ground game, Castillo is probably the better wrestler. Miller's a good wrestler too, but I mean, Castillo definitely can work some heavy takedowns, and he's been able to take down some pretty good people throughout his UFC career. But against Miller, I think it's going to be tricky, and Miller is very crafty with his Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I mean, he's a decent wrestler with a great BJJ game. Miller has been able to tap out all kinds of people throughout his MMA career. I mean, most notably Charles Oliveira, who nobody else has really submitted. So you always have to be careful with Jim Miller when it comes to the ground game. I mean, the guy is extremely legit, has great arm bars, great leg locks, and of course he'll dive on chokes if he sees one, if there's an opening. But I mean, that's where he's definitely most dangerous. And Castillo's going to have to be careful because basically the best way for him to win this fight is to dive right into Jim Miller's strength. So I think it's going to be a very tough fight for Danny Castillo because I don't see him knocking out Jim Miller on the feet. And while Jim Miller is in a decline, Danny Castillo just isn't quite at that level where he could take advantage of it like Beneil Dariush was able to do in their last fight. And Dariush is an elite ground game specialist as well. So him getting Miller on his back, I felt fine about because I did not see Jim Miller submitting him. But I could see Jim Miller tapping out Danny Castillo from his back if he does get taken down. And on the feet, Jim Miller does have some really underrated boxing. I think he can, piece up Danny Castillo, who is pretty much a one-punch type of guy, just wings those big power strikes. So I can see Jim Miller outworking Castillo on the feet, and I can see Jim Miller submitting Castillo on the ground. And I just don't see Danny Castillo out-wrestling Miller for 3 straight rounds. So I have to side with Jim Miller, decline or not. So my pick is Jim Miller. Now, Reed, what are the numbers tell us for this one?
Well, they definitely show that Danny Castillo loves to attempt takedowns. He has a very, very high takedown attempt rate. His accuracy is low, but this is a common theme with wrestlers who try to shoot a lot. They eventually get you down. And so his takedown control stat is very high. Jim Miller has been controlled on the mat. He does respond with a lot of submission attempts, whereas Castillo is not particularly active on the mat. Not a lot of submission attempts, not even a lot of strike attempts, and not even many advances. But he just goes for the takedowns, lands them, holds you there, and then you start over again. So stylistically, I would say he's not much of a threat because you're right. If he goes toe-to-toe with Miller, Miller is going to be more resilient. He's also dangerous with his hands, and he is normally working at a higher striking pace. So Miller gets some edges there. Even though his accuracy of strikes isn't all that great, Castillo maybe a little tighter, but he's just not doing much of it. So I don't think Castillo's a threat on the feet. He is going to be trying to set up those takedowns, The question is, can he wrestle for 3 rounds and not get dinged up by Miller? And can Miller defend any of those takedowns and keep it standing? So this is kind of a style mismatch because Miller's submission game is very, very good. Castillo, I think, is pretty good at staying out of trouble. And honestly, if it weren't for the Ferguson fight with Castillo, I would probably immediately go with Jim Miller here. But Danny Castillo actually did use his wrestling very effectively against Ferguson. He wasn't threatening a finish at any point. He was just holding him down, stifling him. And Ferguson is a much more dangerous striker than Jim Miller is, and much more rangy, a longer range fighter. So Castillo was actually able to deal with that, stay out of trouble, and just get him down eventually, drag him down. Now, he lost a close split decision there, but the fact that he even survived 3 rounds was probably more than most give him credit for against such a dangerous striker, and he did legitimately keep it close. So that forces me to maybe be a little bit more reserved here because he does have the skills to simply wrestle people for 3 rounds. It's not the prettiest MMA, but it is surprisingly effective. And if Miller can't damage him on the feet or get a submission, which I don't really see that happening, he could end up on his back for 3 rounds. So while I think Miller is definitely more of a threat to finish this fight, Castillo could drag this out and force a very close split decision, one that might be bringing a lot of boos along the way. So it's one that I don't think is very bettable, but it's hard. This one's a toss-up. I still want to lean Miller because I think he is more technically skilled and versatile. It's just Castillo's wrestling forces me to consider that he might just get a decision here. And as the odds are very close, but as a slight underdog, Castillo does have a chance.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Reed. Now, moving up to the light heavyweight division, we have John Vellante, who is 13-5, taking on Tom Lawler, who is 9-5 with 1 no contest. Now, Nick, what's the MMA oddsmaker's perspective on this one?
Up in Vellante, minus 170, the comeback on Lawler, plus 130. And this one has been bet up a little bit. Vellante is now minus 225. The comeback on Lawler is plus 185. So with Lawler having so much time out, I mean, he's been out since his submission victory over Kuiper, and that was back in April of 2013. So he's been out a couple years. He's moving up to 205 pounds again. It's been a while since he's competed at 205, obviously. And he's been a little bit injury prone the last couple years. So people are fading Lawler a little bit. Outside of the fact that he's been doing some WWE style wrestling, I forget what the organizations outside of WWE are called or whatnot. So on the lower tier wrestling, he's been doing some of that from what I hear. So Lawler's been keeping himself a little busy. He's definitely a popular fighter. He definitely has a pretty good skill set overall. And he's been, throughout his career, he's been competitive against decent fighters. And in fact, against Carmont, a couple fights back for him, a lot of people believe he should have won that fight, and I'm one of those as well. I think he did enough to win that fight. So Lawler's a talented fighter. I mean, his best attributes obviously is wrestling. He's able to control, get the fight to the floor. As far as submission skill goes, he has a little bit of that as well. I mean, his guillotine choke is sick. I mean, once he gets around your neck, forget about it. The fight's over. So he has that going for him. He's capable of finishing on the ground. He's capable of controlling his opponents and getting it down as well. But stylistically against Vellante, and why I think people are coming in that way, it's a tough matchup. I mean, Vellante is going to be the bigger fighter. He's going to have the pure strength advantage for sure. On the feet, I think you got to give the edge to Vellante. Now, Lawler does have some power on the feet, so you can't count that out. But at the same time, I think overall, striking-wise, Vellante has the advantage. And he's got, again, more, I think, effective striking in total. Now, also, Vellante's wrestling and takedown defense is obviously decent as well. I mean, he's hard to get to the floor. He's hard to control. Offensively, he doesn't have bad wrestling. He's just the type of fighter that prefers to use his wrestling to keep the fight upright and outstrike his opponents. He does have the potential to get the fight to the floor if he wants it as well. I mean, if you look back at his fight against Fabio Maldonado, he fought very smart in that first round, minus the cardio, the flu, whatever. You know, he had some issues going into that fight. I realize that, but still. So he's capable of doing that if he wants, but more times than not, he prefers to keep it upright. And against Lawler, I think he's going to probably want to do that as well. So I got to give Vellante credit. I mean, I think a lot of people were counting him completely out against another wrestler with, a little bit more of a skill set offensively in Corey Anderson that he's facing against Lawler, and Vellante looked good in that fight. His cardio looked much improved as well. He's been training as much of us as we all know, really, with Chris Weidman. So you got to love that as well, because Weidman's a true class act, a true champion. So it can only do good things for Vellante, training with the champ like that. And he's been doing that for years, as we all know as well. So, I think that's finally starting to sink in, and Vellante's starting to finally, like I said, improve on some of those areas that he needed, the most. He's always been a very tough guy to finish. Vellante has a pretty solid chin. I mean, he does get rocked. He does get cracked. Defensively, it is a concern for sure, because, I mean, he eats too many punches. I mean, that's one thing that you don't like to see in a fighter, but at the same time, I mean, he toughs it out, and he's hard to finish. He's hard to stop. So, you got to give him credit where credit's due, I guess. So this is a fight that is catered a little bit more towards Vellante. I think he can sprawl and brawl his way to victory here. He's definitely going to be the more dangerous fighter on the feet as well. So he's looked good. I think he can continue to keep that going here against Lawler. But it's a tough spot to bet, especially where the odds are now, because, man, I mean, people have underestimated Lawler in the past, and he's honestly should have come through. So I think Lawler at 205 is going to be interesting again. And he's going to be a very game fighter, but I still got to lean towards Vellante, because, again, I think he's got the takedown defense to keep this fight upright, and he's the better striker when it comes down to it. So that's why I'm picking Vellante, and I think he is going to get the job done here.
Tom Lawler at one point was a really rock-solid fighter in the UFC at light heavyweight and at middleweight. The problem is he's been out of action for so long. His last fight was in 2013, and that's terrifying to me. And Gian Vellante, he's a fighter that's improved every time we've seen him. I mean, his last fight, he actually was working on his biggest problem, which was his conditioning. He always slowed down in fights, and in his last fight against Corey Anderson, he actually was able to keep the pace going for 3 rounds, and then in the 3rd round, he picks up a knockout. So I was very, very impressed with the improvements that Gian Vellante's been able to have. Now, that's not too surprising considering his gym, which is the Cerro Longo gym. They've got a ton of great fighters over there. So it was only a matter of time, I guess, before he finally started to put it all together. Now, Vellante has a very good wrestling game, and in terms of striking, while he's not the quickest guy, he does have a lot of power, and he mixes it up pretty well. He throws good punches, good kicks, very good leg kicks, and I think he can do some damage here. Lawler, it's not like he's coming off of a loss either. I mean, he scored a submission in his last UFC fight against Michael Kuiper, so, I don't really know. I guess it was injuries and just trying to figure things out in his life, and we just have not seen him in so long. He's been busier podcasting and stuff instead of fighting. So I'm very interested to see how he performs here against Vellante, because Vellante is a very dangerous fighter. Now, Lawler does pack some power. He has a heavy right hand. So if he connects against Vellante, he potentially could put him out. And Lawler does have a decent wrestling game in his own right. So this will be a battle of good wrestlers trying to get the takedown. And if Lawler is able to get Vellante on his back, he could definitely win this fight. He just have to repeatedly put Vellante on his back, and I don't really know if he'd be able to do that. Vellante is very big, very strong. Now, in terms of height and reach, Vellante is the slightly bigger guy, but not by much. Lawler actually won't be a very undersized light heavyweight. He just was a pretty big middleweight when he decided to cut down. So Lawler just decided he doesn't feel like making that weight cut anymore, and he's just going to stick at light heavyweight and keep his strength. Now, that's actually been working pretty well for a lot of fighters lately that have been moving up in weight classes, like Dustin Poirier. So we'll see how Lawler performs. But the biggest problem here for Lawler is the layoff, which is very extensive, over 2 years, and the fact that he is 32 years old now. So, he missed 2 solid years of his prime. So he's going to be rusty coming in there against Vellante. And it's a very dangerous Vellante coming off of probably the best win of his entire career. He's now ranked in the top 15, although the bottom 5 or so of the UFC's light heavyweight division, and you just got to win like 2 fights in a row to get there. So I think this is Vellante's fight to lose. The layoff really does scare me the most with Lawler, and I just have to side with Gian Vellante here. So he's going to be my pick. Now, Reed, what do the numbers tell us for this one?
Well, the big issue here is the layoff for Tom Lawler. So that presents a lot of unknown, and given that he's a mild underdog, I think it basically makes this unbettable, because there is a discount for guys coming off a long layoff like that, and he is essentially at that same discount as an underdog. But Gian Villante, as you guys mentioned, he is very hittable. His strike defense to the head is terrible. It's among the worst on anyone on this card. And while Tom Lawler, even he probably wouldn't describe himself as a finesse striker, he does pack some power and he has scored knockouts. So if he's coming forward and does land something, who's to say that Villante's chin eventually is going to give out? He's now been dropped 3 times. He's recovered from a lot of those fights, sometimes to rally back, but that is a big concern in the light heavyweight division. You can't be taking punches like that. So Villante's stand-up is generally very reserved. He throws a lot of leg kicks. He hangs back a little bit. He is very accurate with his power hand. However, on the flip side, Tom Lawler, very durable, has yet to be dropped. Just a tough guy. He's even fought through injury and still won fights. So when it comes to stand-up, these guys look very, very different on paper. But then the wrestling kicks in. Tom Lawler has a very high rate of takedown attempts. He eventually will drag you down. He's not afraid to put you up against the cage and clinch you there. Gian Villante, actually to date, has very good takedown defense. He's only been taken down once, in fact, out of 17 attempts. So that's very good takedown defense, but can he keep doing it under just a relentless attack? I feel like some guys have abandoned the takedowns against him once he stuffs them early. So, again, stylistically, just very different approaches here. Tom Lawler, he's going to be looking for takedowns, but he's also going to be looking to land a big punch. And that's the thing with Villante. If he hasn't learned to tighten up his defense, I'm not sure he should be risking that kind of stand up. And does he have the submission game to submit Lawler off his back if he does get taken down? Probably not. I think that the most obvious conclusion here is that this is probably going to go 3 rounds, even though they are light heavyweights. It's going to be a back and forth grinder of a fight. Tom Lawler has the experience to get through that kind of fight. But Villante definitely has looked good. There's no arguing that. We just need to see a little bit more from him. So I think this is a good test for him. So to me, not really a bettable situation, especially with the unknowns due to the layoff. But we're probably going to see a grinder, and we should learn some things from this fight.
All right. Excellent. Thanks, Reed. Now kicking off the Fox main card, we have a lightweight battle between Joe Lozon, who is 24-11, and Takanori Gomi, who is 35-10 with 1 no contest. Now, Nick, where did you open this fight, and how has the public shifted things so far?
I opened Lozon minus 260, the comeback on Gomi plus 180, and right now looking over the line at 5 dimes, it is Lozon minus 250, the comeback on Gomi plus 210. Now, line originally dropped a little bit and then climbed back up, so there is 2-way action on this fight as well. A lot of split opinions out there. And you know what? First of all, I got to give both these guys respect because in my opinion, they've both improved. I mean, they both have been talented fighters throughout their careers, and they've been in MMA for a long time. I mean, if you look at Gomi, what he's accomplished, the former Pride champion, I mean, in Japan, the guy's a legend in the sport, no doubt about it, deservingly so. But Lozon, he's been a big part of the UFC for many years now as well, and he's accomplished quite a bit. So these are 2 savvy veterans that have actually, in my opinion, been putting in the work, and they've improved on some of their flaws in both cases. I guess I'll start off with Lozon first here. In my opinion, one thing that hindered Lozon in the past was his cardio. His cardio, he always tended to slow down a little bit, and that, I think, led to a few of those knockouts happening a little bit easier, to be honest with you, because once that cardio goes, your chin starts going even more so, and defensively on the feet, Lozon had some holes in his game, as most fighters do. And that was a nightmare scenario for him. So he's addressed that. He's been putting in the work. His cardio, I think, has looked a lot better. And it's shown because his toughness and overall, I know he's coming off of a knockout loss again to Iaquinta. Iaquinta's on an extreme roll here, recently as well. So Iaquinta has that finishing ability as well. And it was stylistically, it was a bad matchup for Lozon, I think, personally. But this Gomi matchup's a little bit different, although Gomi does hit like a truck. I mean, he's more of knocking fighters out. I still think that, the way this fight's going to probably play out benefits Lozon a lot more. Now, getting it to Gomi, I mean, the guy, again, he's been a legend in the sport. He's got a talented skill set. He has a decent wrestling background as well. So he's hard to get the fight to the floor against. And if he keeps the fight upright, in most cases, he outstrikes his opponents. So Gomi's a finisher. He's always been. He's got that killer instinct that you like to see as well. And again, he's a very talented fighter. What he's improved on, again, is his cardio as well. He used to slow down an awful lot. I mean, especially outside of Japan. I mean, his cardio seems to be a big issue. He's been putting in the work again. His submission defense and his ground flaws, even though he's had some decent wrestling throughout his career, has also been a problem, but he's starting to tighten that up a little bit. He's starting to get, I think, a little bit better with his takedown defense along with that cardio, and is making his opponents struggle to get the takedowns, and he usually is able to find some success again on the feet. So Gomi has put in the work, and it's shown. Now, of course, he's coming out also the first knockout loss of his career against Miles Jury, which could tell us a little bit of something here, because honestly, Gomi's been one of those guys that's always had a very solid chin, always had a hard time getting stopped. But now, again, eventually it came, and he's 36 years old now. So maybe we're going to start seeing a sign of decline with Gomi's chin at this point, which if that's the case, then even though Lauzon's a well-rounded fighter, more known for his grappling, Lauzon's striking is not that bad either. I mean, he could definitely hang on the feet with most lightweights, I think, as well. So that is something you got to be concerned about if you're backing Gomi here, is, coming off a knockout loss, the first of his career. Is that the sign of more things to come here? But as far as stylistically how these guys match up, it is definitely going to be your striker versus grappler matchup, because Gomi's going to want to keep this fight upright, and Lauzon's going to want to take this fight to the floor, because that's where he does have the bigger advantage. Now, it might not be easy, because again, Gomi's takedown defense is pretty decent, but I think along the way, honestly, Lauzon does find his spot, and he does get the fight to the floor. And once he does, it's not going to be too long before Lauzon is able to finish Gomi. I mean, Lauzon is a special fighter on the ground. He's so slick with his submission attack that, most people can't really hang with him on the ground. So I think that Gomi for sure will have a problem and difficulties lasting and surviving against Lauzon's submission attack. So I think that's what you got to bank here. I think if it stays upright, Lauzon could be game as well. I think he could be competitive, and either one of these guys could truly knock each other out. But I think Lauzon's going to play it smart here. He knows that his big advantage lies on the ground. I think he's going to probably look to take this fight to the ground and submit Gomi. So that's what I'm going to go with. I think it does happen. So my official pick is going to be Lauzon, and probably by sub.
While Lauzon isn't a bad striker, Gomi is definitely the more dangerous of the two. I mean, he packs a lot of power. He throws wild, crazy haymakers, and if those connect, they can put anybody out. I mean, that knockout against Tyson Griffin was just brutal, and Gomi was on a nice little stretch there, doing very well in his UFC stint. Looked like he had a nice bit of resurgence, and then he ran into Miles Jury, who just obliterated him. So I think in this fight, he's still going to be very aggressive and still going to be looking, because that's just the way that Gomi fights. Is he's constantly pushing forward and looking for knockouts and just trying to knock your head off. Lauzon, on the other hand, he's a lot more measured with his striking. It has improved. I'm still not a big fan of his defense, where he basically just covers his head with his elbows and just hopes you decide to stop punching him. But his conditioning has definitely improved. That was something that he could not rely on in the past. He would always just be 100 miles an hour until he ran out of steam. So now he definitely is a bit more measured, and he's able to go the full 15 minutes, which is great for him. And his ground game is light years ahead of Gomi's. Now, I know Gomi has decent wrestling, and he's competed in like the ADCCs and stuff in the past, but man, when somebody that is a superior grappler gets on top of him, he gets in a lot of trouble. I mean, Nate Diaz humiliated him in their fight, and I think Joe Lauzon could do the same thing if this fight goes to the ground. Now, the big difference is Gomi is the one that shot in for the takedown in that fight because he was losing the striking. So Lauzon is going to have to find a way to get this fight to the ground, and I don't think Gomi's going to be the one to initiate it. So I think Lauzon needs to close the distance, get some trips, maybe try to just get a single leg or something and get Gomi on his back, because if he does, Lauzon is going to be in great shape. His ground game is so good and so dangerous, and he's so opportunistic with all of his submission attempts. I mean, there's a reason this guy's got so many bonuses. The only problem here is Lauzon has taken a ton of damage throughout his career, so he is starting to get that point where you just can't take too many more shots and rely on being durable. I mean, he has been knocked out by Anthony Pettis. He has taken some big damage. So, I mean, Gomi, if he connects, could definitely put him out, because Lauzon also was finished in his last fight against Al Iaquinta. So, I mean, if Iaquinta can do it, Gomi definitely has the power to do it too. But I think that Lauzon's able to drag this fight to the ground. I think he's able to weather that storm from Gomi, because Gomi's not nearly as technical as Iaquinta was or as Pettis was. And Lauzon can probably brawl his way under the inside, and get this fight to the ground and get that submission. So I'm going to pick Joe Lauzon to pull this one off. Now, Reed, what are the numbers tell us for this one?
I completely agree. This has striker grappler written all over it. But I actually don't think that Gomi's striking stats are as impressive as we're giving him credit for. I think a lot of that comes from outside of UFC competition. He is a southpaw. He has scored a couple knockdowns, but he's been dropped 3 times himself, and he is very hittable. His head strike defense is not good. His chin is statistically worse than Joe, who's been dropped 5 times. So Gomi is vulnerable on the feet too. But I mean, essentially both guys are vulnerable. But neither one of these guys are huge strikers. Joe Lauzon's knockdown rate is higher than Gomi's in the UFC. Again, that's the caveat here. Gomi comes out a little bit more accurate, but the big difference is actually pace. Lauzon does tend to hang back and reserve his strikes, and sometimes I think it takes him a while to get going. He loses a round choosing to stay and trade with someone when he should be taking them down, and that is definitely the case here. I think Lauzon has all the advantages on the mat. I think he does get this down to the mat, and his submission game is ridiculous, and Gomi has been submitted and is vulnerable there. So I definitely see this eventually going down, and then it's going to be Lauzon's world. I think either way, this fight is not going the distance. But I'm feeling pretty confident in Joe Lauzon to win this one way or the other, probably with a stoppage.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Reed. Now, sticking with the lightweight division, we have Edson Barboza, who is 15-3, taking on Paul Felder, who is 10-0. Now, Nick, what's the MMA odds maker's perspective on this one?
Edson Barboza minus 175, the comeback on Felder plus 135. And looking over at the line right now, it is Barboza minus 130, the comeback on Felder plus 110. So 25-cent drop in the dog price. And action obviously is coming in Felder's way. Barboza, every time I set a line on Barboza, it seems like I always undercut it a little bit and it gets bet up. So I thought that was probably going to be the case here, but make no mistake, Felder is getting that kind of respect. I mean, he's looked outstanding thus far in his UFC career. He's had some hype around him before he entered the UFC as a prospect, of course. And since he's entered the UFC, I mean, he faced a very game fighter in Sago, a very good ground fighter that's capable of finishing the fight on the floor. He won a very close competitive decision there. He looked good in that fight overall. It was on short notice. So you got to give him the benefit of the doubt there. And of course, in his last fight, a lot of people were, not really believing in Felder. Honestly, a lot of people thought that Castillo would be able to handle him and get some takedowns, smother him underground, do whatever, do what Castillo does best and at least grind him out and get an easy decision. Felder knocked him out. Obviously, us here at the Premium Oddscast, not to brag a little bit, but we did side with Felder and we did make some money from that play against Castillo. So that was definitely a good bet. Now I think it's kind of opened everybody's eyes to see what kind of talent Felder is. He's got good takedown defense. He's hard to take down and control on the floor. And of course, offensively, I mean, the guy's been outstanding. He has knockout power. He's got good kickboxing. He's got decent fight IQ overall. So the guy is a beast to deal with on the feet. Obviously he's, trains with, the Gracie camp in Philly, but he's also, has done some training with Cerrone, and that's only going to help him, Cerrone crew over at Jackson's camp as well. So, a lot of good things to like about Felder, and you got to like his warrior spirit. He's the type of guy that likes to step in. It doesn't matter, if a fight's on short notice or not. He's willing to step in and fight anybody. And he is, in fact, doing it again here. He's, replacing actually, Miles Jury against Barboza here as well. So, stepping in on short notice against a very talented fighter in Barboza. Here's the thing with Barboza. I've never been that confident in his ability as far as his chin goes. I mean, obviously you got to respect the guy's offensive ability. The guy's a stud. I mean, his leg kicks are nasty. His accuracy is pretty good overall. He's got knockout power on the feet. He can end it with his hands or his feet. I believe the guy has the record for most leg kick finishes, so that tells you something right there. The guy's just a stud, honestly. But why I haven't been too sold on him was because of, honestly, his chin. His durability hasn't been there. I mean, it started all the way back when he got clipped and lost to Jamie Varner, when Jamie Varner actually came back to the UFC. A lot of us were kind of scratching our heads thinking, wow, it finally happened, because Barboza was on a crazy rise towards the top at that point, and Varner kind of derailed that a little bit. But since that time, he looked pretty good up until, again, he's been clipped and he's been dropped a little bit. Cerrone was able to hurt him on the feet before he submitted him as well. And then, of course, in the last fight, Michael Johnson, which has been on an absolute tear, was able to win by decision, a deserving decision win over Barboza as well. So Barboza's kind of been brought down to reality a little bit recently, and I think a lot of people are expecting Felder to kind of check that chin a little bit and possibly finish Barboza on the feet here as well. That's why they're coming in that way. I think that's a very possible outcome as well, because, I mean, if these guys start exchanging, obviously Felder has a better chin, even though I don't trust Felder that much yet either. I mean, honestly, we still have to see a little bit more from Felder. I mean, in that Sago fight, he did start to slow down a little bit. He did get cracked and got wobbled a little bit on the feet as well. So imagine what Barboza would do if that's the scenario here as well. So I think people are underestimating Barboza a little bit, and I think his decision loss against Michael Johnson, Barboza's recent loss, actually, in my opinion, raised his stock a little bit, because against a fighter like Johnson, a lot of people can't survive against the knockout power that Johnson displays. And having a suspect chin to boot, I mean, it makes life even more miserable, and it makes the chances of Barboza losing to a guy like Johnson that much more. So being able to survive that, I think it's actually raised the confidence level to me in Barboza's game. I know that he could take the punishment. He can survive a very tough, hard 3-round fight against adversity as well, because those are some of the things, believe it or not, that you want to see what a fighter could take and what a fighter is able to do, and if he has that quit in him. And Barboza did not have that quit in him in that Johnson fight. So this fight with Felder is actually going to be close. I think Barboza is more than capable of hurting Felder on the feet, because he's more than capable of hurting anybody in the lightweight division on the feet as well. So I think maybe we're all underestimating Barboza a little bit at this spot right now, and we're giving too much credit to Felder. So to me, even though I think either one of these guys can win by knockout and finish this fight, I'm going to actually side with Barboza.
Yeah, this is definitely a striker versus striker matchup. I don't expect to see one single takedown in this fight. It's just basically going to come down to who's the better striker, who's the more durable fighter. And honestly, if you're going in durability, it's definitely Paul Felder. I mean, Barboza has been hurt multiple times in fights. He's been rocked. He's been knocked out. And Felder hasn't been in that situation yet, but he also hasn't been tested by an elite striker yet. So that's the big problem with Felder, is this is a huge step up. I mean, both guys are stepping in on relatively short notice, not a lot, but they definitely are, because this was originally going to be Miles Jury versus Anthony Pettis. So they're each replacing the respective guy. And Edson Barboza, in my opinion, is a slightly longer and better striker of the two, although Felder is extremely dangerous, has great kicks, very unorthodox. If he lands that spinning back fist that he used against Danny Castillo on Edson Barboza, he could put him out too. So I have to give Felder a lot of credit for his unique approach to striking. Barboza is an extremely dangerous striker in his own right. I mean, he probably has the best leg kicks in the UFC. He's finished so many fighters with leg kicks. And he's also a dangerous knockout artist. I mean, he has those spinning heel kick knockouts, and he's knocked guys out with jabs. I mean, he has a lot of power, and he's a very dynamic and very technical striker. Barboza is probably the more technical of the two going in there against Felder. But Felder, he doesn't know how to lose yet. I mean, 10-0, he has a lot of confidence. He's been training with Donald Cerrone, so I think that'll actually give him a lot of confidence, because Cerrone was able to knock down Barboza and then finish him with a submission. So, man, this is just a really close fight, because while Barboza is the more technical guy and he is the more experienced, seasoned guy, Felder has the confidence, Felder has the chin. And if these guys are trading blow for blow, then it's probably Barboza that's going down. But, man, it's going to be very tough. I see this fight as extremely evenly matched, and I think you just have to side with Felder, because he hasn't been knocked out yet. So I'm going to go Paul Felder. So, Reed, what do the numbers tell us for this one?
Well, it is close, and on a card stacked with all these stylistic mismatches, these guys really do look very similar stylistically. Both are definitely strikers. Both guys love to use their kicks. But there's a few points where I would contest. Yes, they have high knockdown rates. We have a very small sample size on Paul Felder, of course, only 2 fights to date. But he did have that crazy spinning back fist. But he was dropped in his UFC debut. He did suffer a knockdown, and overall his head strike defense with power strikes is not good. He is getting hit. He's good at avoiding jabs, but not power head strikes. And Edson Barboza is definitely capable of delivering those, especially with his 5-inch reach advantage. So, Barboza's knockdown rate is higher. he's also been doing it a lot longer. He's much more consistent and reliable as a striker offensively, I think. Now, I agree with you. His chin is a liability. You never know how long this guy's been sparring, at what point it's going to catch up with him where he can't take a punch as well anymore. But the extra range he's going to have, and Paul Felder's kicking attack, that deflates some of his accuracy. Either one of these guys is capable of landing a kick that ends this fight. But Barboza is going to be landing more strikes overall. The question is, how much can Felder stand up to that? Can he be resilient? We don't know yet with Felder. I think we do need to see a little bit more striking out of him and taking punches and surviving out of him before I really want to draw a conclusion. But the early indicators are that he is vulnerable. He's dangerous but vulnerable. Same thing goes for Barboza, dangerous but vulnerable. So in my mind, I'm siding with the experience of Barboza and the extra range that he has. The fact that he did survive against Michael Johnson was a good sign, because he was definitely getting tagged up there, but he made it through the fight, and I think that was the big concern. I was one of the people that thought that was going to end early one way or the other, and it didn't. But this fight also probably should end early one way or the other. I'm guessing there's a 1.5 totals limit on this, not surprising. But I'm going to lean with Barboza. I understand that Felder is dangerous. I just haven't seen enough out of him to be convinced that he can knock off a top-level guy like Barboza.
All right, excellent. Thanks, Reed. Now, dropping down to the women's bantamweight division, we have Miesha Tate, who is 16-5, taking on Jessica Eye, who is 11-2 with one no contest. Now, Nick, where did you open this fight, and how has the public shifted things so far?
I opened Tate minus 210, the comeback on Eye plus 160, and that line's staying fairly steady. Its line margins tighten up a little bit. Right now, it's Miesha Tate minus 190, the comeback on Jessica Eye is plus 165. So there has been some two-way action coming back and forth on this fight. Early on, it was some dog action on Eye, and then again, as we get closer to fight time, some action back on the favorite Tate. This is definitely another interesting matchup. I mean, two of the best bantamweight women in the world that are really looking for that title shot against Ronda Rousey. Of course, Tate's been there twice before and was unsuccessful, and I was right there. Honestly, I know the UFC gave Correia the matchup against Rousey, but a lot of people believe that I should have got that nod before Correia, and honestly, that probably would have been a better fight as well. So it is what it is. The matchmaking, the story background with Correia getting that title fight over Eye is basically what it came down to, not ability, because we all know Jessica Eye would be a much tougher fight for Ronda Rousey, if there's such a thing, because Ronda Rousey's just blown through the whole division, obviously. I mean, she's phenomenal. So, I mean, it's going to be hard to challenge her, period. But I'm saying, as far as realistic skill set goes, I mean, if you put Eye against Betch Correia, I would take Eye all day, and I'm sure most of us would as well. So that being said, stylistically, this matchup is interesting though, because it's tough, man. I mean, Miesha Tate has another one of these veteran fighters. I mean, she's been around for a long time, and she seems to be getting better fight by fight. I mean, it's always been her wrestling game that's highlighted her abilities. I mean, she definitely has a good takedown game, definitely has a good submission game, but she's been working really hard on her stand-up game and developing her skill a little bit more. Her cardio seems to be improving as well. She's just basically learned to train, I think, a little bit better, and it's really improved her game. So you have your typical grappler versus striker matchup here. Even though Tate has become a more well-rounded fighter, she's still going to look to grapple against Jessica Eye, because, again, another situation where she does not want to stand and exchange with Jessica Eye, because I think Jessica Eye is by far the superior striker in this matchup. She's going to have some speed. She has good accuracy. She's got some knockout power to go along with it. So on the feet, if Tate does not take her down, she's going to get torched. I mean, Jessica Eye is going to light her up. So it's all going to come down to whether Tate can get this fight to the floor or not. I think she might be able to get a takedown or two along the way. If she does, Jessica Eye is going to really have to be defensively sound, because, I mean, Tate can definitely finish fights by arm bars, by chokes, by a lot of different methods on the ground. So I know Eye's been really drilling and working hard to keep this fight upright, and working her submission defense as well, because she knows what she's up against Tate. And this is really, if Eye does want to fight against the champion in Ronda Rousey, this is a good stepping stone here, because if she does get the victory over Tate, then she is going to be a little bit more prepared. If she cannot get the victory over Tate, then honestly, she's probably not ready for Ronda Rousey, because we all know, I mean, Rousey's at the top of the game for a reason. So I think this is a big test for Eye. I think it's a test, honestly, she could pass. She's been, again, drilling, putting in the work. I have to be honest here. I'm a little biased. Eye's from Ohio. I know her a little bit, so I'm going to lean towards her regardless, I think, and more times than not, depending on who she fights. So that has to come into to play here as well. But that being said, I do think that this is a fight that's winnable for I think she can sprawl and brawl and get a huge win on her resume here against Tate. I's look nothing but impressive thus far in her UFC career. She's had 2 competitive fights, but they were 2 competitive fights against, I should say she's had 3 overall, but I'm saying the last 2, the 2 fights before the Leslie Smith fight. I'm going to throw Leslie Smith out the window for a second. I'm talking about the Davis and Kaufman fights is what I'm referring to. Alexis Davis and Sarah Kaufman, of course, are 2 of the best bantamweight fighters in the women's division the UFC has, and Jessica is right there along with them because all 3 of those girls were very competitive with each other. So that being said, I really believe that Jessica I is going to be coming into this fight a better version of herself, and I think that's going to be enough to probably get the job done over Miesha Tate. So my pick is going to be Jessica I as an underdog to come through and get the win.
Yeah, and while I'm a big fan of Jessica I think this is going to be a really tough fight for her. You got to go back to her UFC loss, which was against Alexis Davis, and in that fight, she had a lot of trouble with the ground game where Alexis Davis was taking her down. And you look over at Miesha Tate, and while her nickname now is Cupcake, it used to be Takedown, and that's still what she does. I mean, she gets in there, she shoots for takedowns, puts her opponents on their back, and then just outworks them. And occasionally will go for submissions. Against Jessica I don't see any reason why Miesha Tate wouldn't do that. I mean, you look at her last fight against Sarah McMahon, an Olympic wrestler, and Miesha Tate got dropped on the feet, she got hurt in the stand-up, and then when the fight went to the ground, Miesha Tate was actually the better ground fighter than an Olympic silver medalist wrestler. So I was very surprised that Miesha Tate had that wrestling edge. I thought that she was going to get blown out in that fight, and she just didn't. She showed a lot of perseverance, a lot of heart, and then came back and won the second and third rounds convincingly. So Miesha Tate has excellent wrestling. She's able to out-wrestle an Olympian, and if she can do that, she can definitely out-wrestle Jessica I. Jessica I is very quick, very athletic, and she was, now that she is at bantamweight, she started to add a little bit more muscle to her frame because she was fighting at flyweight, but she was a big flyweight too. So I think if this fight stays standing, Jessica I could definitely knock Miesha Tate out. I mean, she has good power, she has a very good technical striking, a good jab, good combinations. The problem is, if Miesha Tate closes that distance and takes her down, Jessica I's ground game is a bit suspect. And she has been submitted before by Aisling Daly, who now fights at 115. And against somebody like Miesha Tate, I just think that she's going to be a little bit too strong for her. Now, if I is able to avoid those takedowns, then she could definitely, just poke away at Miesha with some good kicks, with some jabs, and just wear her down. But I just think it's going to be really tough. While she is extremely talented, I think this is the type of fight that's going to expose a little bit of her faults, which is the defensive wrestling against the really high-level fighters in the UFC. She hasn't really faced that yet, and even when she didn't face that, Alexis Davis does not have great wrestling. She was still able to get her down. So you just got to use MMA math here, and I think this is actually a situation where MMA math works, where if Alexis Davis was able to get Jessica I down and Miesha Tate was able to out-wrestle an Olympian in Sarah McMahon, then I think Miesha Tate out-wrestles Jessica I. So my pick is going to be Miesha Tate to pull off the win. Now, Reed, what do the numbers tell us for this one?
Well, the numbers are definitely backing up the fact that this should be a wrestler versus striker matchup. Jessica I, her striking stats are superior to Tate. They're very similar offensively, although I gets the edge in her pace and cage control. But defensively, it's even more of a gap. Jessica I does not get hit as much. She's been more resilient, and Miesha Tate has been getting hit, and she has been getting knocked down 4 times to date, which is a lot. And you might not remember it, but it's been happening over time. But on the ground, completely flipped. Miesha Tate, she is attempting a ton of takedowns. Another situation where it's a wrestler, they attempt a lot of takedowns. Their success rate is not very good, but they are eventually getting the fight down to the ground. And so Jessica I, she's only faced 3 takedown attempts. 2 of them got her there, and she was held there. And so Tate, who knows how smart she'll fight out of the gates. Sometimes you wonder what her game plan is, but she probably will run into trouble if she tries to just stand and trade with Jessica I. which is why I think she eventually tries to go for the takedowns and she eventually gets it there. And I think that's the difference in this matchup. The line is pretty steep on Miesha Tate. She clearly has the better fight credentials in terms of facing championship talent. But it's the wrestling that I think is the single biggest difference in this matchup. And that's why I got to lean with Tate here. I'm not sure how much juice I'm willing to lay on that because of the striking matchup. But she's probably the safer play.
All right. Excellent. Thanks, Reed. Now moving on to the main event of the evening, we have a bantamweight title fight between current champion TJ Dillashaw, who is 12-2, and former champion Renan Barao, who Dillashaw dethroned, who is 35-2 with 1 no contest. Now, Nick, what's the MMA odds maker's perspective on this one?
I opened Dillashaw minus 215, the comeback on Barao at plus 165. And right now, looking over the line at 5 dimes, it's minus 220 for Dillashaw. The comeback on Barao is plus 180. Line margins tighten up a little bit. Some two-way action coming in on this fight as well. And I think that's going to continue to be the trend. I mean, both these guys are so talented. Obviously, Barao, the former champion, Dillashaw, the newly crowned champion that's actually defended once in between as well. And both these guys, their skill sets are phenomenal. I mean, Dillashaw with his wrestling background, he's always had that obviously going for him, but he's definitely sharpened his skills with Ludwig and crew over at Alpha Male as well. And he's developed into the champion that he is because of the hard work and the preparation, the training that he's getting, and he's looked phenomenal. I mean, on the feet, Dillashaw is an outstanding striker now. He's got a lot of power. His footwork and movement is great. That's why Barao had fits with him in the first fight, to be honest with you. It was just hard for Barao to get in his groove, and especially after early on when Dillashaw rocked him. I mean, a lot of people think it changed the complexion of that fight, and it certainly must have impacted it quite a bit there as well. So Dillashaw is just, in my opinion, he's never been better. I mean, he's definitely at the peak of his career right now. He's got to have confidence going into this fight as well, because, I mean, what he was able to do, and at that point, I mean, nobody thought Barao would honestly lose for a while. I mean, he was going to be the dominant champion, maybe like Jose Aldo is at 145 and 135, and Barao was looking like that kind of champion. I mean, just running through opponents, left and right. I mean, all challengers, he looked great. He either finished them by knockout, he submitted a lot of them too as well. I mean, top tier guys. So Barao is a beast. And he's very talented everywhere the fight takes place, and he's better than most people anywhere the fight takes place. Now, of course, in his last fight, a lot of people were disappointed. I mean, he needed to rebound and get a win under his belt again. I think it was good for him against Mitch that he was able to do that. But a lot of people are saying, man, he didn't even look good against that, in that performance as well. So there's something going on with Barao. And I think that's impacting the betting line a little bit, because honestly, the line should be a little bit tighter. I mean, even though Dillashaw did, win that fight and it was pretty clear the first time around, I still think that this fight can be competitive, and one punch either way could change the complexion of the fight. And if Barao lands on Dillashaw, you could say the same thing. So, line margin should probably be a little bit tighter, but at the same time, I mean, Barao is a very capable finisher, and he's outstanding everywhere the fight takes place. But I do think that stylistically, matching up against Dillashaw is not a good fight for him. And I think that just it's one of those cases that Dillashaw is that guy for Barao that he just will not have a lot of success against. So in my opinion, it is Dillashaw's fight to win or lose. If he doesn't get knocked out or submitted, which I don't think he will in this spot, I think he's going to probably outpoint Barao, if not finish him again as well as the fight goes. But and that's outstanding. It's not going to be an easy task. I think this is going to be a fight of the night type of candidate for sure. I mean, you got two of the best 135ers going at it in the world, skill, with power, with intelligence, everything you like to see. I mean, this is a heck of a main event. I'm glad we're finally, we've been waiting a while to see it happen again. I'm glad we're getting it, because I've really been looking forward to this fight, and I don't think it's going to let down. So my official pick is going to be Dillashaw. Honestly, the line is a tad bit high, so those of you guys that are just willing to throw Dillashaw in parlays and go crazy on this fight because it looks too easy, just be a little cautious. I mean, because this is a new matchup. Barao's going to be ultra motivated for sure to get his belt back, and he had to be a little bit embarrassed with his performance the first time around as well. So just everything factoring into this, it's going to be a competitive fight. Just be cautious here, but I am leaning towards Dillashaw to get the win, and I think he does do that.
Yeah, TJ Dillashaw definitely shocked the world in that when he won the title, I mean, he was a huge underdog at the time, and it was a very one-sided beatdown. Now, there's one thing that people have repeatedly brought up. There's always that one excuse. You have the Cain Velasquez if he hadn't fought in Elevation against Verdum. You have Chad Mendes with a full training camp against Conor McGregor. And then the one was, what happens if Renan Barao does not get almost knocked out in the first round against TJ Dillashaw? He never recovered. So that's going to be the big question here is how's Barao going to perform against TJ Dillashaw this time around? He's not going to have that same level of confidence and swagger. I mean, honestly, Barao in his next fight against Michie Gagnon did not look that impressive. I mean, he was having some trouble with Gagnon. Now, granted, Gagnon is a very talented bantamweight prospect in his own right, but Barao was definitely having some difficulties with him before he did eventually finish him. So maybe Barao just has lost a little bit of something. I mean, he's still young. He's still super talented. He's a good striker. He's long. He's big for the division. He's incredible on the ground in terms of his submission game. I mean, this guy can take your back and dive on an opportunity for a submission on just a snap of a finger. But TJ Dillashaw was able to outwork him, and TJ Dillashaw was able to hurt him multiple times and then finish him. And that's just something that no one else has come even close to doing. Now, how is he able to do it? I've done multiple reviews of TJ's performance against Barao, and there's a lot of little things that he was doing, a lot of little tricks that he's added to his game that have made him a very dangerous threat in the bantamweight division. Dillashaw uses incredible footwork and constant movement, always adjusting his angles, almost Dominic Cruz-like, where he'll take an angle that Barao's not expecting and land a strike maybe at less power than would be ideal, just because he won't see that one coming. So he does a lot of real little tricky things, some really impressive types of strikes that his opponent just has a lot of trouble preparing for because nobody else really does it. So I've been very, very impressed with the improvements that TJ Dillashaw has made in his striking. Now, is Dillashaw still flawed? Yeah, sometimes he gets a little over-aggressive, and he can get clipped. I mean, he did get knocked out by John Dodson. He got rocked by Hugo Viana. So that is the possibility there that if Barao connects with something really solidly, he can still hurt Dillashaw. He's not immune. But, man, he has improved so much on the feet. And basically his two fights, his last two title fights, have been completely one-sided shellackings. I mean, granted, the last fight was Joe Soto, and he didn't deserve to be fighting for a title, but Dillashaw still beat the tar out of him and then got the late finish. So this time around, Dillashaw just needs to keep putting that pressure on Barao because, as we saw, Barao just does not handle that nearly as well. So if Dillashaw can do that without wading into something, he's going to be in really good shape. And Dillashaw does have excellent scrambling and wrestling ability. So if Barao does want to try to attack with the submissions, it's going to be really difficult because I expect Dillashaw to just want to keep this fight on the feet and beat Barao up over the course of 5 rounds. Now, he will always have that in his back pocket. If something happens, maybe he gets hurt, he can shoot in for a takedown and try to get Barao down. And I expect Dillashaw to be confident enough on the canvas from top position to not get submitted. So I think that's one of the biggest advantages of Dillashaw is at this point in his career, he's probably the better striker than Barao. He is quicker and a little bit more explosive than Barao. His conditioning is through the roof. The guy can just go for 5 minutes. He can wear you down. And he has that wrestling where if anything goes wrong, he can shoot in and win back the round or just clear out the cobwebs. So as talented as Renan Barao is, as dangerous as Renan Barao is, I think TJ Dillashaw is that much better at this point in his career. The development and growth has just been exponential for him, and I think TJ Dillashaw repeats history again and maybe even gets an earlier finish this time around. So I like TJ Dillashaw. Now, Reed, what do the numbers tell us for this one?
Well, it's interesting. The first time that Dillashaw fought Barao, his numbers were actually somewhat favorable. In terms of performance metrics, Dillashaw looked very good on paper, and Barao looks okay. You have to remember he's facing obviously continuously top level talent, but his stats are not actually exceptional in any way, maybe with the exception of his takedown defense and his power. And so that's how a lot of these fights were ending. He was able to stuff takedowns and then hurt someone on the feet. Dillashaw came in with more accuracy, better defense, and a much higher pace, and he was just lighting up these combinations. Wasn't necessarily forcing the takedowns, which a lot of people thought he was going to do. He just went toe-to-toe, and he beat Barao at his own game. And Dillashaw, on paper, has only gotten better since then because it was a dominant performance against Barao and a very dominant performance against Soto. Barao's stats were, so-so in his win against Mitch Gagnon, but now we're looking at the stat line and Dillashaw looks even better. That said, I would pick Dillashaw here, but I'm looking at the betting line thinking these guys are still very close, and Barao is still a dangerous guy who finally tasted defeat after a very long time. He's very motivated, obviously, to get his belt back, and this is a fight that he very much wants. So if he comes in hungry and aggressive and doesn't backpedal the way he was against Dillashaw in that first fight and allow himself to get picked apart, we could see a very different fight, at least a more competitive one. But Dillashaw's pace, I mean, he is putting on combinations, very technical combinations, and he's putting them together very well, and he is doing it all the way to the fifth round, and he's actually finishing guys in the fifth round like he did against Barao, like he did against Soto, and that's very impressive in its own right, that kind of conditioning and that commitment to fighting and finishing. So I am going to go with Dillashaw here. I am going to be a little bit more conservative, I think, than most, and be wary about the line. I wouldn't want to lay much more than 2-1. I think 2-1 already is cutting it close. I think this could be competitive. That early knockdown in the first fight definitely changed how that fight went for the rest of the 5 rounds. If Barao is more conservative, and just smarter, maybe even more aggressive, gets Dillashaw trying to worry about the strikes and going backwards, that knockdown maybe doesn't happen in the first round, and that changes things, and he does win a couple of those rounds. So I, again, like Dillashaw, but I do urge caution. Don't pay too much on this guy. Don't be throwing him into parlays left and right, because as with many other fights in this card, this is a tough one.
So that'll do it for our full event breakdown for UFC on Fox 16. Part 2 of the Oddscast featuring our premium bets will be out this Friday night following the weigh-ins, so stay tuned for that if you're an MMA Oddsbreaker premium member. Also, if you'd like to become a premium member, just go to MMAOddsbreaker.com and you can sign up in the top right corner of our homepage. If we have a free play to give out, make sure to follow @MMAOB Premium on Twitter, because that's where we'll post them first. We can also notify you of our free bets via email if you prefer that method. Just send an email to picks@MMAOddsbreaker.com and we'll add you to our free bet mailing list. Special thanks to our sponsors, 5 Dimes and Countermove. Good luck, everyone, and hopefully the betting gods are on your side this weekend.